He spent 25 years searching for his brother's killer. But when a demolition crew found a buried box, the tapes inside revealed a truth worse than murder. His brother wasn't dead, he was erased. And the monster responsible was the town's own sheriff. What do you do when justice means destroying the person you swore to protect? Some places don't just lose their industry, they lose their memory. Barrows Deep, Ohio, was one of those towns. It lay nestled in a valley carved by a river the color of rust, a place where the skeletons of steel mills clawed at a perpetually gray sky. The silence that settled after the last factory whistle blew in the early 90s wasn't peace. It was a vacuum, and in 1998, it swallowed a boy whole. His name was Leo Vance. He was 17, a quiet kid with ink-stained fingers who saw the world not as it was, but as it could be drawn in the pages of his sketchbook. He was a quiet kid, not shy, but observant, the kind who'd watch a storm roll in for an hour without blinking, just to see how the clouds folded into themselves. He wasn't the kind of boy who ran away. He was the kind who anchored himself to the familiar, his aging parents, the worn path to the library, and the volatile, protective orbit of his older brother Sam. On the night of October 12th, the air thick with the smell of burning leaves, the two brothers had a fight. It was a stupid argument, the kind that flares hot and fast over car keys and a broken promise. Sam, 18 and restless, hurled words that were meant to wound, words he would spend the next quarter-century trying to take back. Leo, retreating into a quiet that was more powerful than any shout, simply took his jacket and walked out the back door. The screen door slapped shut behind him. No scream, no sign of struggle, no sound, just gone. The initial search was frantic, fueled by Sam's guilt, a roaring engine of panic. He led the charge, scouring the woods that bordered their property, calling his brother's name until his throat was raw. The town's sheriff, Elias Thorne, a young, ambitious man barely a decade older than Sam, organized the search parties. He projected an aura of calm authority, his voice a steady presence as he reassured the Vances that they would find him. He was handsome, charismatic, the kind of man a town in decline looks to as a sign of hope. But the forest wasn't finished. It held its secrets close. Days turned into weeks. The search parties dwindled from dozens of concerned neighbors to just Sam and his father walking the same paths over. A missing persons report was filed. A BOLO alert was issued. The case file, opened with a flurry of activity, began to gather dust on a shelf in Thorne's office, officially open but practically forgotten. The earth, it seemed, gives back what it takes, but sometimes it waits until everyone has stopped looking. And for 25 long years, no one looked for Leo Vance. Barrows Deep had a new ghost, and his name was the most haunting sound Sam had ever known. Time in Barrows Deep moved differently for the Vance family. For the rest of the town, years passed, marked by the shuttering of the downtown diner and the high school's shrinking class sizes. For the Vances, it was always October 1998. Their home became a shrine of quiet hope and painful memory, a place where the air itself seemed thick with unspoken words. Leo's bedroom remained untouched, a perfect time capsule of a life interrupted. His charcoal drawings of mythical creatures and shadowed landscapes stared from the walls like silent witnesses. Finished sketch of a dragon, its scales meticulously detailed, sat on his easel, waiting for a hand that would never return. His mother, Eleanor, faded first. Her conversations began to loop, circling back to the night he left, her mind picking at the wound until it never closed. She'd ask Sam if he'd checked the woods, if he'd called Leo's friends, years after those initial searches had ended. She didn't want someone to accept her pain. She wanted her son back. His father, a man who had once seemed as strong and unyielding as the steel he worked with, withered. He retired from the furnace and took up a permanent post by the living room window, his gaze fixed on the road, as if willing Leo's familiar figure to appear over the horizon. The not knowing was torture. The endless questions without answers were slowly destroying their sanity. And Sam, he was trapped in the echo of that slammed screen door. The guilt from their final argument was a splinter beneath his skin, a constant, dull ache that shaped the man he became. He stayed in Barrows Deep, foregoing college, foregoing a life of his own, tethered to the house by a sense of duty and a suffocating need for penance. He took a job at the local auto parts store, his days filled with the smell of oil and rubber, a mundane routine that kept the larger grief at bay. He watched his friends leave, get married, have children, the ordinary milestones of life that felt to him like a language he could no longer speak. Sheriff Elias Thorne's career, however, blossomed. He became a fixture in the town, his authority growing as the town's prospects shrank. He was re-elected, term after term, a symbol of stability in a world of decay. He was seen as a man who cared, who understood the quiet suffering of his community. When asked about the Vance case at town meetings, his face would adopt a mask of somber regret. He'd speak of the tragedy of runaways, the pain of not knowing, the limits of what law enforcement could do without evidence. He'd visit the Vances once a year, on the anniversary of the disappearance, his presence a performance of civic duty that felt to Sam like a stone being pressed on an open sore. For 25 years, the case file remained cold. No witnesses, no clues, just silence. And in that silence, Sam aged, the ghost of his brother walking beside him every step of the way, a constant reminder of a single unforgivable moment. Before we continue, tell me, where in the world are you watching from? It matters, because a story like this sinks its claws deep into a community, but the search for answers can span the globe. It creates a network of memory, a community of witnesses who refuse to let a name be forgotten. By the time he was 43, Sam Vance was a man hollowed out by grief. His parents were gone, buried in the local cemetery, their passing a quiet surrender to a sadness too heavy to carry. Sam was alone in the house now, the last keeper of his brother's memory. One morning, staring at his own reflection, a tired man with his father's weary eyes, he made a choice. He would no longer be a passive mourner. He would become a seeker. He carried himself not with vengeance, but with exhaustion, the kind that only comes from holding on too long to a hope too heavy to bear. He quit his job at the auto parts store and dedicated himself to a single mission: to find the truth, no matter what it cost. The living room of the Vance home was transformed. He built what he called the Wall of Memory. It was a massive corkboard that covered the entire wall, a chaotic, desperate collage of a life. In the center was a map of Barrows and the surrounding counties, its surface punctured by dozens of colored pins. Photos of Leo, from a smiling toddler to the haunted-looking teenager in his last school picture, were tacked around the map. He'd fought for years to get access to the official case file, and now photocopied pages of police reports, witness statements filled with half.
Remembered details and phone records were pinned to the board. Strings of red yarn connected faces to places, dates to times, weaving a web of unanswered questions. It was the desperate cartography of a lost case, a visual representation of a quarter-century of dead ends. He began his own investigation with a methodical patience he didn't know he possessed. He wasn't the hot-headed 18-year-old boy who had run screaming into the woods anymore. He was a quiet, relentless force. He revisited every location from the initial search. He interviewed Leo's old high school friends who had long since moved away, tracking them down through social media and alumni networks. He spoke to the teachers, the neighbors, anyone who might hold a forgotten fragment of that time. Most offered only condolences and faded recollections. But his persistence began to stir something in the town's stagnant memory. He was no longer just the grieving brother. He was an investigator, a man with a singular, unnerving purpose. Sheriff Thorne watched him from a distance, the official interest of a lawman tinged with something else, something Sam couldn't quite name. It felt like irritation, a quiet disapproval of old wounds being reopened. It felt like a warning. Truth in a town like Barrows Deep doesn't rise to the surface. It has to be excavated. For 25 years, the old Blackwood foundry on the edge of town had been a derelict monument to a dead industry. Its windows were smashed, its brick walls covered in the faded graffiti of teenagers who were now middle-aged. Its cavernous halls, where men had once wrestled with fire and steel, were home only to pigeons and rust. The town council, in a rare act of forward motion, finally approved its demolition to make way for a discount supermarket, a symbol of the town's diminished ambitions. In late September, nearly 25 years to the day since Leo Vance had vanished, a crew from a contractor 2 counties over moved in with their heavy machinery. They were just men doing a job, oblivious to the ghosts of the town they were tearing down. The work was loud and brutal. The autumn wind cut through the skeletal remains of the foundry's frame, their beams clawing at the gray Ohio sky like desperate fingers. Walls of brick collapsed into clouds of red dust that settled on everything. Steel beams groaned and fell with a thunderous clang that echoed across the valley, a sound that felt like a final belated death rattle for the town's past. On the 3rd day of the demolition, a bulldozer operator named Dave Pullman was clearing rubble near what had been the foundry's small, detached administrative office. As his machine's heavy steel blade scraped away a layer of debris and compacted earth, it struck something that wasn't brick or stone. It was metal. The sound was a dull, resistant thud, different from the shrieking protest of twisted rebar. Pullman stopped his machine and climbed down from the cab, wiping sweat from his brow. He kicked at the dirt and uncovered the edge of a large, olive-drab steel box. It was an old military-style footlocker, its surface pitted with rust, but its integrity surprisingly intact. It was sealed shut with a heavy padlock that had corroded into a solid lump of orange metal. Assuming it was just old foundry equipment, maybe containing valuable copper wiring or tools, he and another worker heaved it onto the back of their flatbed truck. Their plan was to cut it open later with an angle grinder, hoping for a small, unexpected payday. They had no idea they had just unearthed a time capsule, a Pandora's box that held the voice of a boy who had disappeared a quarter of a century ago. They didn't know that buried beneath the floor of that forgotten office, they had found the one thing Sam Vance had given up hope of ever finding: a breakthrough. The accidental breakthrough. The kind that only happens when the world has moved on and a new generation with no memory of the tragedy simply starts digging. News travels slowly and barrows deep, but the discovery of a locked box at the old foundry site was unusual enough to make its way to Sheriff Thorne's office by the end of the day. Thorne arrived on the scene himself, his presence immediately changing the atmosphere from one of mild curiosity to official business. He took one look at the footlocker and his face became an unreadable mask. He instructed the demolition crew not to tamper with it and had 2 of his deputies transport it directly to the station. The official line given to the foreman was that it was a potential biohazard, old foundry chemicals perhaps. It was a plausible lie in a town built on industry and its toxic aftermath. But Sam Vance, who heard the news on the local radio while closing up the auto parts store, felt a jolt of something he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was a premonition, a cold, electric prickle at the back of his neck. He drove to the station, his heart pounding a nervous rhythm against his ribs. Thorne met him in the lobby, his expression one of practiced patience. He refused to let Sam see the box, citing protocol and procedure. "We have to do this by the book, Sam," he'd said, his voice laced with the condescending sympathy Sam had come to loathe. "You understand." The footlocker sat in the station's evidence room for 2 days. Thorne brought in a specialized locksmith from the state capitol, a deliberate delay that felt to Sam like an attempt to control the narrative, to get ahead of whatever was inside. Finally, with the county prosecutor present as a witness, the lock was drilled out. The lid was lifted with a metallic groan that echoed in the small, sterile room. Dust floated in the beams of the overhead fluorescent lights like snow caught in a photograph. There were no human remains. There was no weapon. Inside, nestled in the damp, musty air, was a collection of items that seemed to freeze time. A worn flannel shirt, the kind Leo always wore. A stack of sketchbooks, their pages filled with the intricate, dark fantasy drawings that had been his brother's escape. A Sony Walkman, its silver paint chipped, its headphones coiled neatly around it. And at the bottom, a clear plastic shoebox containing 20 dozen cassette tapes, each labeled with only a date, written in Leo's familiar sharp handwriting. The last label read, October 12, 1998. Sheriff Thorne's expression remained impassive, but his eyes were hard. He ordered everything to be cataloged as evidence in the reopened cold case of Leo Vance. The earth had given something back, but it wasn't a body. It was a story that someone had gone to great lengths to bury. Getting access to the tapes was a battle. Sheriff Thorne argued they were part of an active investigation, even though the case had been dormant for decades and he had shown little interest in pursuing it. He was stonewalling, using the bureaucracy he commanded as a shield. But Sam, armed with a public defender who saw the injustice in the situation and the weight of a story that was beginning to leak into the local press, persisted. After a week of legal wrangling, a county judge ordered that Sam, as the sole surviving next of kin, be allowed to listen to official copies of the tapes. The originals would remain in evidence. Sam sat alone in his kitchen, the wall of memory looming over him like a silent jury. He had bought an old cassette player from a thrift store, a clunky silver machine that felt like an artifact from another era. He slid the first tape in, the plastic door clicking shut with a sound he hadn't heard in years. He pressed play. He expected to hear a teenage boy's ramblings about music or school, maybe a clumsy attempt at a love song. What he heard was a voice from the grave, a voice that was both familiar and terrifyingly strange. It was Leo, speaking in a hushed, conspiratorial whisper. Testing 1, 2. I guess this is on. The voice was thin, reedy, laced with the hiss of the old magnetic tape. It's August 14th. I don't know why I'm doing this. Just need to talk, I guess. And there's no one to talk to. The early tapes were diaries. Leo spoke of his art, his feelings of isolation in the dying town of Barrows Deep, the casual cruelty of high school bullies who mocked his drawings and his quiet nature. He talked about Sam, his admiration for his older brother's confidence mixed with a deep-seated frustration. Sam just sees what he wants to see, Leo's voice whispered through the static. He thinks if he can protect me from a fight at school, he's protecting me from everything. He doesn't see the real shadows. He doesn't see that the monsters aren't just in my drawings. As Sam listened, tape after tape, hour after hour, a new portrait of his brother emerged. This wasn't just a quiet, artistic kid. This was a young man living a secret life, one filled with a crushing weight he felt he couldn't share with anyone. The cheerful, reserved face he showed the world was a mask, and Sam, his own brother, had never once thought to look underneath it. The tapes were not clues to a murder. They were a confession of a life lived in silent desperation. They were a slow, agonizing reveal of a secret that had been festering in the heart of their family, unseen and unheard. And Sam realized, with a dawning horror, that he wasn't just listening to a cold case file. He was listening to the sound of his own failure. The narrative on the tapes began to shift in the last half-dozen entries. The tone grew darker, more fearful. Around mid-September, Leo stopped talking about school and started talking about him. He never used a name, only that single ominous pronoun. He spoke of secret meetings, of gifts, expensive art supplies, rare books, that felt like transactions, not gestures of kindness. He described a relationship that had started with mentorship and praise for his art, but had twisted into something suffocating and controlling. Sam listened, his blood running cold, as his 17-year-old brother described the classic patterns of grooming and abuse, spoken in the confused, ashamed language of a victim trying to convince himself that what was happening wasn't real. "He tells me I'm special," Leo's voice crackled, the sound thin and fragile. "He says that no one else in this town understands, that my art is important. And I believed him. I wanted to believe him. But when I'm with him, I feel small, like one of my drawings that he can just fold up and put in his pocket." The shame in his brother's voice was a physical thing, a weight that pressed down on Sam in the quiet of his kitchen. He heard Leo describe being isolated, being told that their friendship had to be a secret because other people wouldn't understand the special connection they had. He was being pulled away from his family, from his world, into an orbit of secrecy and fear. The final tape, the one dated October 12, 1998, the night he vanished, was the most chilling. Leo's voice was different. The fear was still there, but it was edged with a brittle, desperate resolve. Around mid-September, Leo stopped talking about school and started talking about him. He never used a name, only that single ominous pronoun. He spoke of secret meetings, of gifts, expensive art supplies, rare books that felt like transactions, not gestures of kindness. He described a relationship that had started with mentorship and praise for his art, but had twisted into something suffocating and controlling. Sam listened, his blood running cold, as his 17-year-old brother described the classic patterns of grooming and abuse, spoken in the confused, ashamed language of a victim, trying to convince himself that what was happening wasn't real. "He tells me I'm special," Leo's voice crackled, the sound thin and fragile. "He says that no one else in this town understands, that my art is important." And I believed him. I wanted to believe him. But when I'm with him, I feel small, like one of my drawings that he can just fold up and put in his pocket. The shame in his brother's voice was a physical thing, a weight that pressed down on Sam in the quiet of his kitchen. He heard Leo describe being isolated, being told that their friendship had to be a secret because other people wouldn't understand the special connection they had. He was being pulled away from his family, from his world, into an orbit of secrecy and fear. The final tape, the one dated October 12, 1998, the night he vanished, was the most chilling. Leo's voice was different. The fear was still there, but it was edged with a brittle, desperate resolve. "He knows I'm pulling away," Leo whispered, his voice so low Sam had to lean in close to the speaker. "He's getting angry. He said if I ever told anyone, he would destroy my family. He said he would make Sam's life a living hell. He said he owns this town, and I believe him. He can do it." There was a long pause, filled only with the faint hiss of the tape. "So, I'm going to make it stop. I have a plan. I'm going to disappear tonight. Not die, disappear. So he can't hurt them anymore. So he can't hurt me. I have to. This is the only way." The tape ended with the sound of a click. Sam sat in the silence, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room. His brother hadn't been murdered.
He hadn't been the victim of a random act of violence. He had been erased. He had chosen to vanish to protect his family from a monster who knew them, a monster who walked the streets of Barrows Deep. And the man who held the eraser was still out there, living his life, while the Vances had lived in a tomb for 25 years. Every answer was like a knife made of fog. You could feel the edge, but not see it. Sam played the last tape again and again, dissecting every word, every pause, listening for a clue he might have missed. "He owns this town." The phrase echoed in his mind. Who could a 17-year-old boy in a place like Barrows Deep believe had that kind of power? It had to be someone with authority, someone respected, someone who could move through their lives without suspicion. He thought back through the fragments of memory that the tapes had dislodged. Leo mentioned that he had been the one to get him a special pass to use the high school library's darkroom after hours, a privilege no other student had. He remembered his mother talking about how he had visited their house after Leo won a regional art prize for one of his charcoal landscapes, praising the boy's talent in front of his proud parents. A cold, sick certainty began to crystallize in Sam's mind, a horrifying image taking shape from the disparate pieces. He went to a dusty box in the attic, the one filled with old family photo albums and newspaper clippings. He found the one from 1998, its pages yellowed and brittle. And there it was, a photo clipped from the local paper, the Barrows Deep Chronicle, dated May of that year. A grinning, awkward 17-year-old Leo was holding up his first-place ribbon from the art competition. Standing next to him
One hand resting possessively on Leo's shoulder was a young, smiling Sheriff Elias Thorne. The betrayal was a physical shock, a blow that knocked the air from Sam's lungs and left him gasping. Thorne, the man who had led the search, the man who had comforted his mother, who had placed a reassuring hand on his father's shoulder, who had performed his role as the town's protector for 25 years. He was the monster. Every visit to their home, every somber word of condolence on the anniversary of Leo's disappearance had been a lie. It had been a calculated act of surveillance, a way to monitor the family and ensure his secret remained buried just as deeply as the footlocker at the old foundry. This wasn't just a case of disappearance. This was a cover-up of monstrous proportions, orchestrated by the one man everyone in Barrows Deep had been taught to trust. Monsters aren't just found in basements. Sometimes they wear a badge and are elected sheriff for 6 consecutive terms. The pillar of the community was the rot at its core. Sam's investigation changed. The grief that had been a heavy, suffocating blanket for 25 years now sharpened into a cold, clear rage. It was no longer a search for a ghost. It was a hunt for a predator. He had to operate in the shadows, knowing that the most powerful man in the county was his adversary. He couldn't go to the local authorities because the authorities were the enemy. The past wasn't gone. It had just been quiet, and Sam was about to make it loud. He started looking not for Leo, but for a pattern. If Thorne had done this to his brother, it was unlikely Leo was the only one. He spent weeks in the dusty archives of the local library, sifting through microfiche copies of the Barrows Deep Chronicle, his eyes burning from the strain. He was searching for any mention of Sheriff Thorne interacting with teenage boys, particularly those who were artistic, quiet, or outsiders. He found dozens of articles, Thorne presenting academic awards, Thorne speaking at Career Day. And then he found it. A series of articles from the late 90s about a youth mentorship program Thorne had started, a club called the Sheriff's Explorers. It was presented as a way to give troubled or directionless boys a sense of purpose, a positive male role model in a town where so many fathers were unemployed or absent. The photos showed Thorne with his arm around a series of smiling, awkward teenagers. Sam made a list of every boy pictured in that club. He then spent days cross-referencing that list with public records, searching for who still lived in Barrows Deep. An alarming number of them had left town abruptly between the ages of 17 and 19, often within a year of joining the club. The official records were vague. Some were said to have joined the military, others to have moved away for jobs that never seemed to materialize. They had simply vanished from the town's social fabric, their departures quiet and unexplained, just like Leo's. Sam managed to track down one of them, a man now in his 40s named Marcus Dunn, living in Arizona and working as a mechanic. Over the phone, Marcus was guarded, his voice tight with suspicion. But when Sam mentioned Sheriff Thorne and the Explorers Club, there was a long, heavy silence on the line. "Let me give you some advice," Marcus finally said, his voice low and tight with an emotion Sam recognized as fear. "You're digging up a grave. Some things are better left buried. Thorne, he doesn't just run the town, he owns it. He helped my family when we were about to lose our house. Then he helped me leave town." The implication hung heavy in the air. This wasn't just a predator, it was a system. a shadow network that used the town's economic desperation as leverage, trading favors for silence and ensuring its victims were quietly, efficiently removed. Stay with me, because this is the moment the entire story turns on its head. This is where the search for truth becomes a burden, not a liberation. Sam now held the weapon he had spent his entire adult life searching for: the cassette tapes. They were the proof. They were Thorne's crimes, described in the terrified whispers of his victim. He could take them to the state police, to the FBI. He could ignite a firestorm that would burn Thorne's life, his reputation, his legacy to the ground. He would have justice for the years of pain, for his parents' stolen lives, for the brother he'd been forced to mourn while the monster who caused it all patted him on the back. But as he sat in his kitchen, the stack of cassette tapes on the table in front of him, another truth, a more complicated and terrible truth, settled upon him. The tapes were also proof that Leo had succeeded. He had escaped. Somewhere out there, a 42-year-old man who was once his brother might have a new life, a new name, a family, a measure of peace carved out of the ruins of his childhood. He might be happy. He might have found a way to outrun the ghosts of Barrows Deep. To release the tapes would be to drag that man back into the spotlight. It would mean revealing the deep, private shame of the abuse to the entire world. Leo's name would forever be linked not to his art or his courage, but to his victimhood. It would destroy the new identity Leo had risked everything to build. And it would destroy the idealized memory his parents had died clinging to, the memory of a lost boy, not a broken one. Sam stared at the wall of memory, at the smiling face of his 17-year-old brother, and was paralyzed by an impossible choice. What is justice if its price is the very peace the victim fought so hard to find? Is it justice to expose a monster if it means re-traumatizing the person who escaped him? He had spent his life believing that the truth would set him free, that it was a force for good. But the truth in his hands was a double-edged sword. It could deliver a killer to justice, but it could also deliver his brother to a new kind of prison, one made of public pity and endless questions. The truth, he was beginning to realize, wasn't simple. It wasn't clean. The truth was a weapon, and he wasn't sure who it would hurt more if he pulled the trigger. The choice was no longer between knowing and not knowing. It was between vengeance and mercy. Sam made a decision. He wasn't going to the state police. Not yet. He needed to look the monster in the eye. He called Sheriff Thorne's office and requested a meeting, his voice carefully neutral, saying he had something personal and final to discuss about the Leo Vance case. Thorne agreed, his tone oozing a practiced sympathy. He told Sam to come to his home that evening. He wanted the meeting off the record, away from the station. Sam knew it was a test, a power play. Thorne wanted to meet on his own ground, where he was king. Sam walked up the long, paved driveway of Thorne's immaculate colonial house, a fortress of prosperity that stood in stark contrast to the decaying homes in the rest of the town. He was clutching a small, portable cassette player, his knuckles white. Thorne greeted him at the door with a warm, disarming smile, and led him into a handsome study lined with mahogany bookshelves and gleaming civic awards. He was calm, paternal, the very picture of a concerned public servant. He offered Sam a drink, which Sam refused. "I hope you found some peace, Sam, after all this," Thorne said, his voice as smooth as polished wood. This discovery must have been a terrible shock. Sam didn't speak. He just placed the cassette player on the heavy oak desk that separated them and pressed play. Leo's voice, small and trembling, filled the quiet, opulent room. He said, "If I ever told anyone, he would destroy my family." Sam watched Thorne's face, searching for a crack in the facade. For a fleeting second, he saw a flicker of something in the sheriff's eyes. Not fear, but annoyance. A flicker of cold, reptilian anger. The mask of the benevolent protector slipped back into place almost instantly. Thorne let the tape play for another 10 seconds, before holding up a hand, a gesture of weary patience. "A troubled boy," Thorne said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "It's a tragedy what can happen when a young mind becomes unstable. The stories they invent to cope with their pain." Sam stared at him, dumbfounded by the man's breathtaking audacity. "I know it was you," Sam said, his voice flat and dead. Thorne smiled, a cold, empty thing that didn't reach his eyes. "You know nothing, Sam," he said, leaning forward slightly, the warmth gone from his voice, replaced by a chilling confidence. "You have the sad, rambling diary of a runaway. It's my word, the word of a man who has served this community for 30 years, against the ghost of a boy who abandoned his family in the middle of the night. Who do you think they'll believe?" In that moment, Sam understood. Thorne wasn't afraid of the truth. He was confident he had already buried it long ago. A week later, Sheriff Thorne, perhaps to force Sam's hand and cement his own narrative, called a press conference at the town hall. He announced a final, conclusive update on the 25-year-old cold case of Leo Vance. He stood at the podium, a figure of solemn authority, bathed in the harsh light of a single television camera from a regional news station. He spoke of the tireless work of his department, the pain of the Vance family, and the bittersweet relief of finally having answers. Then, in a masterstroke of public manipulation, he invited Sam to the microphone to share his family's findings. The town's small press contingent, a handful of local bloggers, and the aging editor of the weekly paper leaned forward. This was the moment they had all been waiting for, the final chapter in Barrows Deep's most enduring mystery. Sam walked to the podium, his face pale and drawn. He held a prepared statement, his hands trembling slightly. He could feel the weight of Thorne's gaze on him, smug and certain. He could feel the ghosts of his parents, his brother, his entire life pressing in on him.
He had wrestled with his decision for days, the tapes playing on a loop in his mind, a chorus of vengeance and mercy at war with each other. He looked out at the small crowd, at the familiar faces of people he had known his whole life, people who saw Thorne as their protector. "For 25 years," he began, his voice surprisingly steady, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "My family and I have lived with the question of what happened to my brother, Leo. The recent discovery at the old foundry has finally given us an answer." He paused, and the room held its breath. This was his chance. He could burn it all down. "The evidence we recovered," he continued, the lie heavy on his tongue, "evidence I have personally reviewed with Sheriff Thorne, confirms that my brother was not a victim of foul play." A murmur went through the room. He made the difficult choice to leave Barrows Deep and start a new life elsewhere.
He was a young man in pain, and he did what he thought he had to do to find peace. He didn't mention the tapes, the abuse, or Thorn. He simply asked for privacy for his family as they processed this final, bittersweet closure. He was officially closing the case his brother had opened with a click of a cassette player. Thorn stood beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder in a grotesque pantomime of support and shared grief. Sam had chosen to protect his brother's new life, even if it meant letting the monster who broke them stand in the light, celebrated as a hero. He had buried the truth a second time under a mountain of public silence. The official story settled over Barrows Deep like a fresh layer of dust. Leo Vance was a runaway. The mystery was solved, albeit in an unsatisfying, anticlimactic way. The Vance house was just a house again, no longer a shrine to a ghost. The wall of memory was taken down, its web of questions and dead ends packed away into a box in the attic. Sheriff Thorne's reputation was burnished, seen as the man who had finally brought a measure of peace to a grieving family. He had weathered the storm. He had won. But some mysteries don't end with handcuffs or courtroom confessions. Some end in silence and a choice. Justice had been served, but it had come late, carved from stone and sorrow. And sometimes, justice isn't a single loud event. Sometimes, it's a quiet, patient process. Weeks later, Sam Vance sat at his kitchen table in the quiet of the evening. The house no longer felt haunted, but it felt empty. He had 2 padded manila envelopes in front of him. In each, he had placed a complete, high-quality set of dubbed cassette tapes from the copies the police had given him. With them, he included a typed, anonymous letter detailing everything he knew about Sheriff Elias Thorne and the Sheriff's Explorers Club, including the names and last known whereabouts of the other boys who had left town. He explained the pattern, the leverage, the system of silence Thorne had built. He didn't mention Leo's new life or his potential location. He focused only on the predator and his methods. He addressed one package to the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit in Quantico, Virginia. He addressed the other to the lead investigative journalist of a major Ohio newspaper in the state capital, a woman known for her relentless pursuit of stories about corruption and abuse of power. He hadn't chosen silence. He had chosen his weapon. He had sacrificed the public spectacle of personal vengeance for the cold, methodical certainty of institutional justice. He would never get the satisfaction of seeing Thorne exposed in his own town, of watching the faces of the people who had trusted him as they learned the truth. But he had planted a seed. He had started a different kind of fire, a slow-burning one that would be tended by people far beyond Thorne's reach, people who specialize in hunting the monsters who hide in plain sight. He drove to a post office 2 towns over, under the cover of a rainy afternoon, and mailed them. As he drove home, the sun broke through the gray Ohio clouds for the first time in what felt like forever. He didn't know if Leo was alive or if he was happy. He might never know. But he had finally honored his brother's last wish. He had made sure the monster couldn't hurt anyone else. And in the quiet of his own heart, that was a justice he could live with. The fight for the truth was over. The fight for a reckoning had just begun. Sam's choice leaves us with a difficult question. What is the true meaning of justice? Is it public accountability or private peace? Could his decision, made to protect his brother,
have unintended consequences for Thorne's other potential victims? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. The story of Leo Vance is a reminder that sometimes the deepest wounds are the ones no one can see, and the greatest courage is found not in a shout, but in a whisper. Thank you for watching Deep End Stories. We are a community dedicated to uncovering the stories they tried to bury. If you believe no name should stay forgotten, don't forget to subscribe to Deep End Stories and hit the notification bell. Well, we'll see you in the next investigation.